Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Rapici, we meet again.
Very fancy seeing you here. How are you?
I barely got that out tonight. Here we are.
This
is what happens when we have the evening train. When we had the evening train broadcast. But
well, it's all good, man. It's all good. It's good to see you.
Yeah,
And
it's good to see you.
Tonight we are talking about a little Jacques Attali, I believe is the pronunciation.
Attali is what Google told us. Attali. Jacques Attali. We're talking. Okay, I'll say something besides Jacques.
His name.
Attali. Yeah, his name. We're talking about a chapter called "Repeating" from Jacques Attali's book "Noise: The Political Economy of Music." And true to form, we're going to talk a lot about the political economy of music, if not so much about noise. We're probably going to end up talking more about this concept of silencing as much as we are going to talk about Attali's concept of noise. But we're certainly going to be talking about both music technologies and also what else? Also about the various ways in which technology is imbricated with I guess the consumption of technology and how music sort of interacts with that.
Yeah, there's a nice, I think that the timing of this following our discussion of Gould is really nice, because a lot of I found that the two overlap nicely, and then it seems that we reach a point and Gould veers left and Attali veers violently to the right. And so I think it's
not politically, we should say not politically.
No, not politically,
just in a very different direction.
I think philosophically, what's fascinating to me about this before we jump in is that they diverge despite having a very, very, very similar foundation. It's like they're just reading the tea leaves very differently.
Very close. Yeah, but their entry into the question of music is through the idea of sound recordings and the reproduction of sound. That's both their starting point. And so you're right. Even though they veer apart, it's almost diametrically opposed in certain points. And also, I would say they're diametrically opposed at certain points. It is very interesting that their point of entry, this idea that the invention of sound recording and the distribution of sound recordings is a game changer. That's both of their that's their starting point for both their work. We should also say, I don't want to cut you off on that, but just another point, on similar point or slightly divergent point from what you just said, but I think still part of the same tree. There's even the genesis of having this Attali episode is we finished talking about background music and Glenn Gould's praise of background music, and that's something we talked about. He talked about, Gould talks about the pedagogic value of background music. And I mentioned to Michael, I don't know if I did it in the episode, but I think it was afterwards. I said, you know what? There's this guy named Jacques Attali, and he doesn't like background music. Gould loves it, but like Attali says the exact opposite. And so I reread it, Michael read it, and we said, golly, they do diverge. And it'll be interesting to talk a little bit about where they converge and where they diverge, hence this episode.
Right.
So does that set things up enough? Maybe we should look at a passage and gloss it, and then we'll try to think about, or how do you want to do this? Do you want to look at a passage first, or do you have like opening remarks?
My thinking, and I think just as sort of an organizational rubric here, I think maybe
that's in order. Let's just say organizational rubrics are in order.
And let me tell you right now that
let's hear that.
Nothing sexier than those two words put together.
No,
I was thinking that the general outline is the general discussion is predicated upon the fact that Gould, which was the discussion last time, by the way, it wasn't really the discussion last time because we found a sneaky Adorno and Horkheimer episode buried that had somehow
Oh, I'm
not been
sorry.
published. So for those of you listening, there is a
Found the
Horkheimer and
bonus
Adorno
cut.
culture industry episode that we somehow forgot to hit publish on. So you got a freebie in that one. So
I forgot the
accepting
bonus cut. Thank you.
it
Thank you
is,
for
yes.
thinking practically. Yeah.
The archive got deeper. So anyways, to focus here, if we look at Gould, the discussion there really centered around, okay, so we now have recorded music and what's it going to do to live performance and to music in general? How does it function as background noise? A lot of that is actually the discussion that Attali lays out. And I think that the way that you and I have talked about this in our little pre-show meeting, we're really going to follow that plan. It's what is the effect of the archive, right? What the recorded music creates an archive. What is the effect of having that
What's the
archive?
effect of it? Yeah.
And then following Gould, really, that archive gets purposed or repurposed as background music. And what is the effect of background music? How does background music worked according to Jacques Attali? And in both cases, he comes to a different conclusion than Gould. So I think as far as just the breadcrumbs to follow, I think that's the plan. Right? That's the
No,
plan.
it's good. We should remind listeners who, or just point out to listeners who, especially since, as you remark, we made it confusing for everybody, as is our want. But we are talking about the previous episode on Glenn Gould's "The Prospects of Recording" essay. So just to mention that, from 1966, I believe. And we're going to be talking today about Jacques Attali's Noise, published in 1980. So that gives us the time frames. And Michael, while you were talking, I realized that, boy, talk about convergences and divergences. Even the outline of the, I didn't think of this until you said it. Okay, this is a chapter. This is not a standalone essay. This is a chapter from Attali's book, but I just realized that the outline of this particular chapter repeating totally dovetails with Glenn Gould.
Yeah.
He opens up with a historical lesson. I guess Gould gives less history and more personal experience, but they end up talking about why sound recording and sound recording technology is a game changer. Then Gould modulates into an argument about the creation of the listener, the expert listener, and Gould is very malleable in that category. One of the things that's interesting about his essay, when he says that sound recording makes everyone an expert listener, he also includes would-be professional musicians. Everybody becomes an expert listener. And then finally, as you were pointing out, the last bit of the essay, he brings up Gould raises the question of background music and gives it a totally positive valence. But now that's where, as we'll discuss, Attali diverges. But until you said it, I didn't realize it's a straight arrow line.
Well, let me ask you a question about this, because the interesting difference here is that Gould handles his discussion fairly succinctly. It's a fairly tidy art essay. It's not terribly long. What I found interesting about the fact that these two follow not in the same, but a very, very similar arc, is that Attali does this over nearly 50 pages, right? As a chapter, this is a big chapter, almost to the point where I wonder why it's not split into two. But he obviously felt that this was the same discussion, right? So what's telling is that not only does it,
you answered it though, that he feels that there is a through line. Sometimes it's hard to see though, because it's so damn long, right?
Right. So the discussion, I guess what I'm saying is, and that's the point I was trying to make, is that both men see this idea and the various parts of the idea as necessarily belonging to the same discussion. So the question really is, all right, we have sound recording. What's the effect of the archive?
Right.
And then once this sound recording seeps out, leaks out, once it is used as, and they both agree, it's going to be used as background music to, it's the soundtrack to your life. What is the effect on that? So this, despite the fact that they end up in totally different neighborhoods here, both of them agree this is the discussion front to back, or at least these are the parameters of that discussion.
Yeah, I just lingered on that for a moment because I didn't realize that throughout this long chapter, it's throughout Gould's shorter essay, but even throughout this, mammoth chapter from Noise, there is that, kind of similar arc, but from very different perspectives, as we've already said. Maybe we should, anything else you want to say, or should we just sort of dive in?
Let's jump in.
We'll try to set the scene as I'll read a passage or you'll read a passage. How about that?
Okay, so the first section that we've identified here is on page 15 of the version we have. I say that just say it's about a third of the way into the essay. And he's talking about the effects of recording. So this is just prior to the discussion on the archive. And he says, at the same time, usage becomes transformed. Accessibility replaces the festival, a tremendous mutation, a work that the author perhaps did not hear more than once in his lifetime, as was the case with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and the majority of Mozart's works, becomes accessible to a multitude of people and becomes repeatable outside of the spectacle of its performance. It gains availability. It loses its festive and religious character as a simulacrum of sacrifice. It ceases to be unique, exceptional event heard once by a minority. The sacrificial relation becomes individualized, and people buy the individualized use of the order, the personalized simulacrum of sacrifice.
Hey, Michael, I know you're going to read the next paragraph as well, but there's so much going on in the first paragraph.
Let's stop here. So
we're agreed.
Where do you want to begin with this?
I have a couple places to begin. How about that? And then
you
can, and I want you to interrupt me and I want you to add on. Okay. First thing I thought that would be helpful to gloss is an italicized passage that ends the first sentence. At the same time, usage becomes transformed. And then this is the italicized passage. Accessibility replaces the festival. We should explain the larger trajectory that he's been arguing, or the argument he had been making prior to this point was this, that recording, and this is about the creation of the archive. Sound recording, initially, he's given historical evidence, Attali has given historical evidence to back up this claim that the original intention, the original aims and focus of sound recording was simply preservation. But at a certain point, and it takes a while to do so, there becomes a gradual pivot. And the pivot is toward this idea that the recordings are important. It's not just preservation. You're preserving something that you can reuse, repeat, re-listen to. And that functionality, the new functionality of the sound recording, where accessibility, mass accessibility, potentially, if everybody buys the same item, mass accessibility becomes a new part of the functionality of music. Now, when Attali writes, accessibility replaces the festival, he uses the terms throughout the chapter several times. What festival, and he also uses the word in this paragraph, performance, sacrifice. Oftentimes he talks about ritual. Really what he's thinking of, and so listeners and readers don't get lost, he's basically talking about the performance aspect of music, the concert aspect of music, live music as opposed to the recording. And what he said, and so I'll shut the F up after and let you talk after let me just finish that gloss on accessibility replaces, and I'm just going to try to restate.
Certainly.
Accessibility replaces the festival. So what this means in Attali's language in the context of the chapter is sound recording, because it's accessible, gives a new functionality to music. And as such, it gives a kind of new center to the musical experience. Gone, or what will eventually get replaced or pushes aside. We're at the beginning of a process, so I won't talk about replacement or pushing aside. But right now, what he's noticing is that with the accessibility of sound recordings, Attali is noticing there becomes a potential to push aside the live performance, the ritual, communal aspect of listening, a chance to push that to the side. It's a beginning of a long process that Attali will say, eventually argue that the last 100 years of recording, now over 100 years of recording, sound recordings, have been pushing us to a point where accessibility, the new incredible functionality of music, is going to replace the idea that music is only to be had in certain places at certain ritual, i.e., set, scheduled. You don't F with the ritual, right? The scheduled time, ritual just means schedule, right? You have rituals at, it's about time, right? You don't F with the time. Accessibility is all about effing with the time of listening. So okay,
we've got the after dark. Barry Falk is salty. I like it. So
I'm censoring myself. This is the G-rated, PG at best. Anyway,
not salty.
Okay, I want to stop there, but does that sound fair?
So I just a couple. This raises some questions for me, but I kind of want to add just a few things to it. So one of the things that he mentions that happens here, right? And he talks about this where the artist or the musician has maybe only heard this once or twice in his lifetime, but suddenly the audience has unlimited access to it.
Right.
We've really, there's a massive juxtaposition here, right? Where the center is no longer the musician. The audience now gets to be at the center in terms of when and how often this gets heard. But the great irony here is that the audience has now been shrunk into this, he talks about this later, and I don't think we're going to actually get to this point. So I'm going to, spill a few beans here.
Yeah, tell us.
Right. One of the funny, and this, and he and Gould are still in the same place at this point. One of the ironies here is that as the spectacle is diminished, you create the listener. The focus is no longer on the musician. The focus is on the listener. Listening is always by its nature an individual experience. So there's a weird alienation to this almost. So what you have is this recession of community and the ascension of the listener. So in an odd way, though it's more available, there's an alienation. Along those lines, and this is where it's interesting, and I have a question for you, Barry, and how you take this. As the spectacle dies, the ritual dies, right? We no longer need live performance because I have on-demand performance. He says, where is it here? It's stripped of its value, right? It ceases to be a unique, exceptional event heard once by a minority. There's no longer the exclusivity and the value that the spectacle had, that instead it's become just an individual experience. I wonder if it's possible, and I think I suspect that he has the answer to this later, and we'll discuss this. But is it possible that the individual can create value? Or does value always have to be social?
Well, I have an answer to this question, and it has to do with a little nagging voice I had in my head when you were reading the passage. I too noticed the ways in which. So I'll answer this question this way. Attali in this passage, and often in the chapter, I think, Michael, and you tell me if you agree, I think he often constructs this binary so that he constructs a binary. And I think he does it in this paragraph, and not only in this paragraph, so that it seems to be a zero-sum game. That insofar as music has moved away from collective experiences to the individual realm, that's necessarily a hollowing out or a alienation, in kind of strict dogmatic Marxist terms, the shift from a communal experience to an individual, more individualized nexus. I mean, Attali certainly assumes that that's a loss and a degradation. But now here's so I said nagging voice. Actually, the nagging voice that I had. Well, first off, do you agree with me on that? I mean, it sounds like you do. Like there's a binary here.
So far, I'm with you.
Okay. So I'll tell you the nagging voice I heard. And ironically, the nagging voice I heard was Mr. Marxist himself, Tough Teddy Adorno. And I'm thinking, I can't remember I think it was the phonograph record essay, right? But you correct me if I'm wrong. But Adorno, I think it is the phonograph record essay where Adorno mentions as a positive use, a positive value, a positive functionality of the record player is the individualized communion with the material artifact of the sound recording. And wait, as if that weren't enough, he says, I'll give you another analogy for it. And you saw it in Proust. And you're in good shape if Adorno is quoting Proust. You're in the right way. You're going the right path. It says, he references Proust and talks about the experience of the individualized museum goer. That's an individualized, isolated performance. But Adorno says this is a moment of personal enrichment. He doesn't talk about it as a degradation of value. So, I mean,
but sure. Let's keep Adorno around for a second. Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
In that essay, Adorno is arguing that the one real perk to recorded music is that it preserves the music, and in doing so, it saves it from the attempt to modernize it, fancy it up, jazz it.
And actually, spectacle.
Right. Well, that's where I was going. It saves
please.
it from spectacle. Whereas Attali is basically saying that it's, so I don't think they disagree, right? Like Adorno would have spectacle die because spectacle is taking away, it's harming the music. Attali is saying, well, when we do this, it kills spectacle, but there's value, there's a religiosity to this that is taken away. And so I think, again, it's funny that the nice thing about this is that everybody agrees until they don't. And I think that we're still in agreement at this point. I think Adorno and Attali are like, yeah, this is what it does. They just view spectacle differently. I wonder though.
Can I? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the question I was at, the question I'm trying to get to is that as an alienating force, you are dissolving the power of the social because there is no socialization. It is now individual.
But why is that an alienating force? That's my point. And I would argue that Adorno is saying that's not an alienating valence. You see what I'm saying? I mean, I agree with you. It is the assumption in this passage is that moving it to the individual register is alienating. That's absolutely right. But I'm reading the Adorno passage. Maybe you're reading the Adorno example differently, but I'm reading the Adorno example as a case where he's talking about individualizing. He's talking about subjective responses to the aesthetic, but it doesn't seem to be alienating.
Is that? Yeah, I didn't mean to jump on.
No.
Is that because Attali and I feel like we risk being sort of insufferable here, referencing too many people outside of this essay. So I think we shouldn't linger too long. But I guess my question is
But
Um,
our listeners are definitely familiar with these essays because we've talked about them in previous episodes. Hype, advertisement, blatant promotional
yeah,
moment. Okay,
insert
yeah.
insert
Now
your
I'm done.
jingle
I'm done.
here.
Insert
Um,
your jingle here. Go ahead, please.
you can also listen to the DeBoer episode as well, so you can really appreciate what
I
Barry just
wanted to
did.
talk about spectacle. So,
So
but anyway,
but my question
go
is this:
ahead,
I
please.
think, could it just be that Adorno sees spectacle as a degrading influence that music needs to be saved from?
The
And
spectacle. Yeah,
well,
yeah.
okay, so that's not fair.
No,
I'm
go
not being
ahead. Go
accurate.
ahead. I'm sorry.
That
Hmm.
he's concerned about what live performance is doing
Yes, right, right,
outside
right,
of the
right,
music.
right,
And his
right.
argument is that all of the filigree that is the extra musical performance is detracting from the music. And in that regard,
Yeah,
a
yeah,
recording removes
yeah.
all of that and just provides you with an an audio experience. The visual is
Great
removed,
point, Michael.
and that is a benefit. What
Great point.
Attali seems to be responding to here is the lack of a communal experience. I think that
Absolutely.
their focus is in a different place, and that might explain the difference. Um, yeah.
Just a quick comment on there, simply because you dovetailed. I said I wanted to talk about DeBoer, but you just ended up doing it. I
Mhm.
think that was a brilliant interjection. I think you're exactly right. The difference is, um, yes, Adorno is concerned with spectacle, but spectacle has a pretty literal, very localized meaning in Adorno. He is talking about the spectacle of kitschy theatrical performances of opera.
Mhm.
That's the spectacle that he wants to. And insofar as the isolated listener is isolated from this distraction from the aesthetic experience presented by kitschy visual spectacle, of course Adorno likes it. And as you and I were talking about pre-game, right, in the pre recording, um, and this is I think, worth mentioning to readers and listeners of the essay, because I think it's kind of the key. Guy Debord is not, and this is so effing French, Michael. This is so French. That to reference, to be everywhere referencing the key words of another writer, and to be always referencing their thought and never to mention or cite them at all. That's what, so everywhere in this chapter he's dropping the word, and in this paragraph, and many other places, he talks about the spectacle of its performance. And you're totally right, Michael. Spectacle here is used, even though he's not cited, he is definitely, I think, thinking of referring to Debord's idea of spectacle as a visual, not as a kitschy visual performance, right? But as a series of images that encourage passive consumption.
So let me
It's the
ask.
total Debordian thing.
Let me
And
ask.
that's the difference.
So just one and a half more things,
Yeah.
right? The fact that Adorno was concerned with opera and Attali is really talking more about just popular music or music, I guess, right?
Michael, is that
But
do you agree with that?
no, no,
I
no, no.
don't
Hold
know if
on.
I,
Let me
yeah,
finish.
okay.
I
Ask your
don't
question,
think.
but I don't know if I agree with that.
Well, what I was going to say is I think that Adorno's concerns would still apply to Attali.
Yeah, and I just did the annoying thing of interrupting a question by saying I don't like your question. So that
Ah,
that's
well,
that's some
so
berry splitting
let me
there.
ask
I
one
demerits here.
let me
So
ask just one last question, and I think you can probably do this with a yes or
yeah,
no,
yeah,
and we could move on because it's not a part of this, but it's been gnawing at the back of my brain since
yeah,
we started the
yeah,
discussion.
yeah.
Do you feel that this idea here would still apply to the visual arts with the ability to record and reproduce images?
No, I, I said that on the fly, and maybe I'll reconsider it by the end of the podcast. But it does seem that in the same way with Gould, it does seem that recording in this case, the axes, the key ways in which Attali is talking about recording, it has to do with sound, it has to do with silence, it has to do with noise. I don't know if there are already visual equivalents.
Okay.
So I think not. I mean, my first answer would be that. Maybe I'm going to reconsider, and I want to see, and I want to hear if you disagree. I want to hear it because I'm very uncertain what I'm saying.
Let's soldier on a bit before I want to dig a little deeper before I hazard a response to my own
Michael,
question, because I don't know.
Michael, well, while we're posing questions we don't want to answer, I want to go back to the question that I cut you off on because it was a great question.
It's become great.
Huh?
It's gone from horrible to great.
No, it wasn't a horrible question. I didn't interrupt you because it was horrible. I don't know why I interrupt you. I'm just rude. I'm a bad person. But if I understood your question, I think it's really relevant, which is now what you were referring to is that he mostly mentions his case examples are jazz and rock, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
But nonetheless, my impulse is to say that he is talking about recording writ large.
Mm-hmm.
And so that Gould, who was mostly talking about so-called classical music, orchestral music, symphonic music, he never references the pop world. But I feel that it doesn't matter. So the kinship, the convergences and divergences between Glenn Gould's essay and Attali's chapter kind of, again, we see them here. That Gould talks about pop music, talks about recording. His examples are exclusively taken from classical music. Attali's examples talks about recording. His examples are exclusively taken, I think, exclusively by jazz and rock music. But I think that really what both of them are talking about is the phenomenology of recording and the phenomenology of listening to sound recordings. So, I mean, that's my feeling about it. But I think I'd be very interested in hearing what you think. Do you want to
I
bracket
think
it off?
I think that
You want to bracket it off?
Excuse me. I think that what Attali is talking about applies to recorded music across the board.
Yeah,
because
that's
he casts a pretty wide net. He's not concerned with the same aspects of the spectacle that Adorno is, and that's what prompted the question. They're looking at this through a slightly different lens. But I think if it is sound recording, and that's the reason why I asked about the visual arts as well. The visual arts don't really fill the same spaces in the same ways.
They do.
And that's why I would be inclined to say no. But I've been known to make the strange U-turn from time to time. So I'm going to officially hold off. Shall we move on to the second one?
Please do.
So that was just a page later. And here he is talking about repetition. So we're still talking about recording. And he says, the major contradiction of repetition is in evidence here. And this next sentence is italicized. People must devote their time to producing the means to buy recordings of other people's time, losing in the process not only the use of their own time, but also the time required to use other people's time. So this is an economic, this is transactional now. His concern has shifted. Stockpiling then becomes a substitute, not a preliminary condition for use. People buy more records than they can listen to. They stockpile what they want to find the time to hear.
Do you want to keep reading or do you want to stop?
No, I think I think small bites are good today.
Small bite. Okay, small bite. Well, are we English teachers or what? This paragraph, this passage is the whole essay, isn't it?
Most of it. It's the
I
first
think it's a
half.
lot of it. Do you want to take a stab at it since I was yammering on forever on the last one? Why do you want to
Well,
take a stab at
I'm going to take a very short
glossing?
poke at it. Okay.
Take a
And
poke.
the
Take a
argument
poke.
here is the first portion, right? We have a contradiction. Okay. We
Yep.
have to spend our time essentially working to enable ourselves to buy money, or excuse me, to buy recordings that other people have taken the time to produce. That's fine. I think the key thing lurking in here is that, boy, the ability to do this includes, or excuse me, what's the word I want? My God, I'm struggling here.
Hmm. Hmm.
Entices us essentially to hoard, right? We are encouraged to overconsume. Time is now the currency. We must spend our time to acquire other people's time, and we will buy more than we can possibly listen to. And I find this interesting because, we were talking before we started recording about how the iPod, when it came out, and the digitization of music, when the advent of the MP3 really created a context where we could see what he's talking about playing out. Right? You had music collections that just became absurdly bloated, that the value was in possession. The idea that you were going to listen to all of the music that you had was downright absurd. It was more about hoarding because you could. And so I think that's really the sort of dark side of what recording enables, is it turns us all into hoarders. Where do you want to go with this?
I mean, that's great. I want to keep on going. Just basically adding a few things to what you said. I mean, this is the process. I guess I have one or two things to say. I guess the first thing to say is we were talking about sound recording. With this passage now, we are talking about the ways in which sound recording necessarily, where you have the invention of sound recording. Then you have this idea that sound recordings are valuable because they give mass accessibility, a new functionality to music, and they make music repeatable, accessible in a way, performances of music accessible and repeatable in a way that it had never heretofore, had. Okay. So there's that. Then, but, what he hasn't explained yet, and what he's trying to explain here, is how that seemingly innocent or blessed invention, the ability to the new accessibility of music, necessarily becomes troped or turned the by its own logic. The logic of accessibility leads to hoarding, leads to stockpiling, leads to this idea that the sound recording becomes a substitute for the real experience and interaction with music. I'm just going to add one passage that we didn't read, but in the same paragraph. I'm going to go
absolutely. Yeah, no, I think really to the end of this section is
yeah,
worth
yeah,
looking at. I just didn't want to run through it all at once.
No, and I'm glad you didn't. But so I think what's really interesting about this paragraph and about his argument is that he talks about the ways in which 50 years ago, I'm sorry, not 50 years ago. This 50 years ago from this particular point that he's narrating. Really, he's talking about the 1870s. I think it's 1860. Let me double check on this. I think I wrote it down.
Well, that'd be like 120 years ago, right?
Well,
oh no, sorry, he's writing. Never mind.
Yeah. Anyway, 1877, and then 1877. He's talking about a process in 1877. There's about like a 20 or 30-year lag time between this idea that, hey, we got records. It takes about 30 years before people say, oh, you know what? Records are great because they give you access to performances. Not just it's cool to hear grandma's voice on a record when we no longer have grandma. now we have this idea that we have a performance of music or a sound recording that can that it's great to be able to hear all the time, not just as a memento. So, but what he, what he feels that even in that moment, there's something incipient in that process that's going to lead to hoarding. This new notion of accessibility is going to lead to hoarding. You want to say something?
I
I'll let you
do.
say.
And I have a question
Sure.
about sort of the
Sure.
incentive to hoard. And you had said something interesting just now about how, it's not about accessing grandma's voice after grandma's gone. It's about accessing these performances. And I
Yeah.
wonder if there isn't this sort of veneer or this idea that, he teases this idea throughout, I think, that spectacle, while greatly diminished, the idea of spectacle, the idea of the performance still has a value. And grandma's voice recorded and placed on a vinyl disc was never part of the spectacle. It simply won't have the same value. However, if we can have access to these performances, even if they are studio performances,
absolutely,
we can still listen to that
absolutely,
and have the idea in play that this is what the spectacle will be. So it's the simulacra of the spectacle. So despite the fact that the spectacle
you just became a French person when you said that. That was amazing. I saw you transform. You
I do feel
Gallic in
a little
flash
different
of light when you said this. What did you say? The simulacra of
the simulacra, yes, of
oh
the performance.
My God! How did you say that sentence?
I don't know.
You are French.
But is that maybe, because I hadn't thought about this until just now, but part of the hoarding is the idea, it's in a way, it's almost nostalgic, right? We're trying to reach back to capture something, or reach out to capture something, a community, a performance, a moment, again, a religiosity that isn't there. And that, I think, if that's his idea, that explains why he's looking at this as hollow. Like Gould wants to kill the performance. If you ask Gould, the recording does not take you to spectacle. The recording puts you in your favorite chair where you can study and you can learn. It demolishes
That's brilliant.
It demolishes the spectacle. I think what Attali is looking at is, well, it's, if you are trying to recapture that spectacle, it's gone. And the very tool that you're using to reach out is what killed it.
Wow, you just took us to a whole other level. That was great. I'm not going to say a damn thing after
it's
that.
Because I'm French. It's because I'm French now.
Your French moment, your French transformation took us to a whole new level. That's exactly, what I was about to ask you, and you just brilliantly answered it. I thought, if we wanted to get to the nub of this passage, we're going to have to explain to listeners. Okay, he's talking about this process about where we become stockpile hoarders, where we all become hoarders. So, Michael, we're going to have to explain why we move so readily, or as a people, as human beings, we've moved from this new accessibility to hoarding and to stockpiling. I was saying we have to explain that to listeners. You just did, right?
I did.
You're always trying to scratch the itch, because the itch, by definition, the itch of ritual, right? The itch of ritual, just because it's done or gone or displaced, even, you're always trying to scratch the itch of that moment with the music, that encounter. And so what do? You keep on buying stuff. And there's a way in which buying is always repetition, always has a nostalgic valence. It's always about repetition. You repeat the action, or a trauma. You're repeating an action because I'm a record collector. And I talk with record collectors, and we all have this experience, which is why Attali, I think this passage is where Attali is dead on. If you talk to a record collector, they're always remembering buying the record. I'm not even talking about listening to the record.
No, you don't need to listen to the record. The record becomes the artifact.
Exactly. I mean, this is the stockpiling thing. if you're a record collector, you remember where you purchased, where you found, you remember
Well,
the record store where you bought the
so
records,
this is, I think this
right?
is the premise, this idea. I'm going to try and take this a step further here. This is the premise for Hornby's High Fidelity, right?
Oh
The
yeah, I guess
idea
so.
that
Yeah,
these become fetish properties, he calls them, right? And
exactly right.
it's
Right,
not about
right.
the actual listening so much as it's about all of the non-tangible intangible sort of, what's the word? God, I'm really struggling with words. Words are hard for me tonight, man.
You were French a moment ago, so I
Abstract.
don't
It's
know what
about
you.
the abstractions around it. It's about the spectacle that this represents more than the contents of the disc
Oh,
itself.
I mean, we're talking about you. You're using the right Marxist terms: alienation, fetishism. You said a moment ago. You're using the right words, I think, and that's what he's talking about. And I have to say this paragraph is the paragraph that always hits home for me, because I always said this to myself. I am the perfect capitalist dupe, for sure, because I often say to myself, I'm buying this record. I don't know if I'll ever get a chance to listen to it, but I
But I have
gotta
it.
own it. I gotta buy it. I am always scratching that itch, but I want to. I'll shut up after I just sort of underscore the word you use, because I think it's really crucial. You're talking about the ways in which this chapter is called repetition, and so much of that repetition is about nostalgia, and nostalgia often is powered by. It isn't just like this idea. It isn't so much the idea that you can recapture. It's your desire, your limitless desire to recapture the first time, or those the excitement you had when you got the record that you really loved. And so it's always about chasing a phantom. um so much of that energy of so much of the energy of stockpiling and hoarding is about chasing this phantom of the first time that you heard something, you had an experience of something. And a word we haven't used, but just to that we should add to this: aura. We're
Yeah.
chasing an aura
Yeah.
that isn't there, right? We're chasing an aura isn't there. And that's one of the reasons we're stockpiling and hoarding. We're chasing that original authentic experience that we feel we had, that was more, that when we were younger, and it's more authentic. And that's driving the motor car. That's what's causing the stockpiling.
Shall we move on?
We shall. I think we should talk about background noise, right?
Let's go.
The other big concept.
Shall I have the section pulled up. Shall
Sure,
I?
sure. Please.
Okay.
Yes.
So
Keep on reading.
so we're now, as Barry had said, we're now talking about the role that the archive plays in becoming background music. Shoot. Okay. So here we go. Take, for example, one of the most.
Before you read though,
Oh,
let's
sorry.
just remind listeners that um Glenn Gould ended his essay by talking about, we discussed this in the previous episode. He discussed background music and had a positive valence. And I'll see if I can
Yep.
quote words that you used a moment ago, a couple minutes ago, when you were talking about the recording for Gould. Sound recording is amazing because the listener is not isolated. The listener is able to study and commune and become a better listener and a better performer and a better recording artist because of their communion.
I
So,
think.
and yeah,
Go.
and
I'm sorry.
background
Go ahead.
music has a pedagogical focus for
Yeah.
Gould.
I think additionally, notably, according to Gould, with the recording music, with the recorded background music, the two things happen. The listener actually gains agency because
Yeah,
they are
right.
able to
Really, right,
manipulate the music. And the
right.
other thing is that there is a banality to the background music. And as a result of the sameness, exceptional works stand out. So the two differences for me, one, you have an active attentive listener with Gould. And there is room for exceptional, valuable work to shine. Are we good?
Right.
Okay. So
I love it. I love it. So
uh,
now we're going to read Attali.
Right. So Attali says, take, for example, one of the most characteristic firms dealing with the music of silencing. So he's making the argument that is very different from Gould here. Muzak. Created in 1922 to provide music over the telephone, it branched out beginning in 1940 into selling atmospheric music.
Can I stop you just to ask you a question about that sentence?
By all means.
Your impression of that sentence. Were you surprised, like I was, about that Muzak was invented so early? I had no idea.
I
associated with the Madman era. I associated with the 50s and 60s.
So, but I think it's also because, yes, absolutely. I quite frankly associate Muzak with an elevator. And so,
yeah.
So to think that it goes back
shocked by that.
To the early 20s, but it's not out of place with his argument, I don't think.
It totally confirms his argument, because it says, and actually one of his other points, one of his other points even is that until, he mentions that, of course, one of his bête noirs, I have to say that now since you're Gallic, one of his bête noirs is the recording industry. And he mentions that, I can talk about the recording industry, but the recording industry really isn't there until after the Great Depression. So that means in the Attali timeline, you have Muzak, you have the potential for background noise, even before you really have the full-fledged recording industry.
Yeah.
That's amazing to me.
It is.
And it really supports his argument.
Okay. So take, for example, one of the most characteristic firms dealing in the music of silencing, Muzak. Created in 1922 to provide music over the telephone, it branched out beginning in 1940 into selling atmospheric music. It has countless clients, stadiums, parks, salons, cemeteries, factories, clinics, including veterinary clinics, banks, swimming pools, restaurants, hotel lobbies, even garbage dumps. I go to the wrong dumps.
Wait a minute here. And now, it just hit me. When have you ever been to a cemetery and heard background music? I've never been to a cemetery where
I don't frequent them, but the list is kind of surprising. Like
garbage dumps. Where's your garbage dump with music?
I guess I go to the wrong dumps. But
is he making stuff up, Michael? Is he making stuff up?
He would never do that. So
I'm sorry.
We'll go finish. That's the end of this paragraph, but the next one I think is a part of our discussion as well.
Yes, it is.
The pieces of music used on the tapes they sell are the object of a treatment akin to castration.
Don't mince words, Jacques.
Let's go right after it.
Don't hold back.
Called, quote, range of intensity limitation. If anything says castration, it is range of intensity limitation, which consists of dulling the tones and volume. They are then put on perforated cards classed by genre, length, and type of ensemble, and programmed by a computer into sequences of 13.5 minutes, which are then in turn integrated into completed series of 8 hours before being put on the market. Wow.
He lived in, this is obviously in the analog age, but I guess he's talking about the digital age, right? An early form of the digital age, right? Okay. So 1922 to the digital age and beyond. Okay. Or into our current digital moment. All right.
So,
and did you want to read? We don't need to do that, but let's talk about this.
What do we want to say about this?
Well, how about, I'll tell you what, I'm just going to add, let me read the paragraph which we didn't mark up here. But it's on the same page.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think that's going to introduce the key terms, and I want to hear your comments on the key terms. Okay. Before Attali gives a specific example of music, Muzak. He tells you why he feels that, he gives you an argument. He argues, he tries to explain why he feels the notion of background music is antithetical to ritual, productive, generative uses of music, why it's part of a negative social function and not a positive social function. So, Michael, I will draw your attention and the listener's attention to a paragraph just right before the one you were reading. And I'll read this paragraph. The situation is not new. After all, Haydn and Mozart, the situation of having background music, playing music that's meant to be not meant to get your full attention. And Attali writes, after all, Haydn and Mozart's works were almost exclusively background music, intended for an elite who valued them only as a symbol of power. But and we should remark on this, as you were saying, Michael, earlier in the pre-game show, power is another of his keywords. And when we're talking about stockpiling, we're talking about hoarding of music, hoarding of sound recordings. And when we're talking about background noise and background music, Attali ties the social functions of music or social uses of music to domination, to ways in which we are disempowered, which the bulk of people are disempowered, in order to empower, I don't know, a ruling elite. I think there's a quasi-Marxist idea here. Anyway, but here, in the current moment, power in background noise, the current here means the current moment of background noise, as opposed to the earlier Haydn, Mozart moment. But here, power has extended its functions to all of society. And music, and you read all those places where the music gets piped in, including in Jacques Attali's world, garbage dumps and cemeteries. Here, power has extended its function to all of society, and music has become background noise, and that's a bad thing, for the masses. The music, here's why background noise is bad. This new background noise is, I'm resuming reading the passage, the music of channelization toward consumption. It is the music of worldwide repetition. It is music for silencing. Drop mic drop. Music for silencing. So you're going to explain what he means by this, since you're having a mind meld with the French.
I'm trying.
Why is it silencing? Why is it the music of world? Why is background music the music of worldwide repetition?
Well, so here's the funny thing. I just had a little bit of an insight as I'm listening to this, right? The argument that he makes earlier about music and background music as being a silencing force is because by its presence, you literally cannot speak, right?
Yes.
It takes the play, it fills that space that you might use to express yourself.
Yes.
Ergo, you have been silenced. But there's something else in here that I hadn't noticed until you read it. So Haydn and Mozart's works are almost exclusively background music for an elite who valued them as a symbol of power.
Of their power.
Right. Exactly. But again, part of silencing is domination and power. Mm-hmm. And so this is the soundtrack to power. It is
absolutely.
It is the soundtrack for the elite. So what happens when the soundtrack for the elite becomes background for the masses? It is a clear indication of the hierarchy and everybody's position in it, because this is the background music that you cannot speak over. We have filled those spaces, and it is the background music of a class that does not belong to you, but it speaks for you. It is quite literally silencing the other voice, and it is normalizing and validating and spreading, right? Background music by its nature is virtually ubiquitous. There are no places it does not go. We are broadcasting far and wide, hey, this is the voice that gets heard. So it's this lovely little bit of sort of propaganda in a way. Like, we're just going to spread it out and you're going to accept the fact that this is the way the order should be.
Well, Michael, I'm fascinated by this idea that background noise, background music also provides a sort of overt message of propaganda for the status quo. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
I can try. So to do this is actually good because it's going to bring us back full circle, and we're probably at that time. So we were talking earlier, and we had mentioned that, or I'd made the statement that recorded music kills the spectacle. It kills the performance, right? And we had said that in this moment, Attali and Gould are in the same place. They just value the performance differently, right?
Yes, right.
Okay. So what's happened, if we're in Attali's world, and we are, is that the recorded music strips the spectacle of its value. And talking about this earlier, I kept using the word religiosity, right? The sort of
aura,
the aura around it. Okay. So if we have to take that as sort of the premise here, that recorded music carries with it an aura. Okay. And that aura is both pervasive throughout the music. And you can think about this. I'm thinking about this in terms of genre, for example, right? There's an aura to genre that transcends any particular recording. It is the glue that holds these types of music together. So if you look at something like Muzak, right, which is our poster child for background music, it is organized according to mood and tempo and tone. The various auras of the background music are impactful. They have an impact on the listener. And so if we had said earlier that the hoarding of music, which creates this massive, personal archive, which is at the same time alienating, is an attempt, subconsciously probably, for the listener to capture the aura, to dwell in the aura, then what happens with background music, especially background music that is chosen for you, and you see this with Muzak, he talks about this with Muzak, is that you are not just subject to the music itself. What makes the background music work, what I've called a propaganda, is the impact of the aura on the listener.
Oh, I see.
You are going to identify this. You are going to physically and emotionally respond to the music in very predictable ways. But beyond that, which is going to be a function of tempo and tone and, how that music is manipulated to create a certain effect. But you are also going, and that's independent of aura in many ways. That is a physical response and an emotional response to this. But there is also what we're calling aura, which is going to bring back the myth of that spectacle, which is going to communicate, in this case, class difference or social position, which is another version of class difference, I guess. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of the propaganda. This return to the spectacle that doesn't really physically exist in any legitimate way, but still holds enough power to keep people in line.
That's fascinating. When you were talking about and you were describing background music and moods and the ways in which background music is organized, Muzak was organized when Attali was talking about. It was always organized according to tempo and mood and things like this. A thought occurred to me. Most of the Spotify playlists,
I was right there.
Right?
Yeah.
They are organized, so it doesn't really matter the content. I mean, this might be we really have
here
to
we go.
stop now.
Here's
We
here's
really
back
have
to
to stop now because it's fluid, right?
Well,
We,
think about
we,
think about the
yeah.
mixtape. I don't know. I think I did this
Well,
religiously when I was younger.
let me
Go ahead.
make sure we're on the same. Let me make sure that we're on the same
Oh,
wavelength.
we are.
I think we are.
We are.
I think we are. It's like it doesn't matter about the content of the Spotify playlist. It's about the form, and the form is there. And the way we interact with the form, it's going to have those psychological effects that you were perfectly describing.
We're exactly in the same place. I was just going to say, I spent the better part of my high school years making mixtapes. And one of the amazing things about that was you would make these tapes and they were often mood pieces. And if you look at the composition of the musicians that formed these tapes, like it was the motliest group of people that would never show up in a regular discussion about anything, save for the fact that they all at some point in their catalog recorded a song
that fit that mood.
And the less similar those bands would be in terms of like genre grouping, the more interesting and satisfying the tape became, because look what I could build.
But when you say interesting and satisfying, those are positive aesthetic terms. What you're describing, I thought seemed like it was more of this kind of subconscious manipulation.
Well, it is. Why would I record this? Well, it's going to make me sad, or well, it's going to put me in this mood, or well, it's going to do that. You're doing it to yourself. The only difference is you're doing it to yourself in that situation.
Okay, we've gotten dark. This is dark. We've gotten dark.
Stop. Must I relinquish my Frenchness now? I don't know.
Say it again, Michael, just to give me, tremors of pleasure as I go off into the night. What was it? The simulacra of spectacle. I got to hear it one more time.
No,
come on.
Yeah, you have to go back and listen to it all over
oh,
again.
No.
Barry, this was a wonderful good time. Thank you. This was fun. We
hope our listeners liked it. Read Jacques Attali. Repetition. We're repeating. We're recommending it, right? Or are we? Oh, okay. That's another episode. We'll talk about that another episode.
It's you know what I would say this. It's a long read. I think I would absolutely look at this in pieces. I would look at this in pieces.
All right. Okay.
Barry, thank you so much.
Qualified praise. It's been fun, Michael. It's been very enlightening. Thank you very much.
Have a great night.
You are not only a rock star, you are a Gallic rock star tonight, and I'm happy to share the airwaves with you. So until next time.
All right, Barry. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.